Some people say the West tests a man with storms and hunger, but the truth is simpler than that. The West tests a man with a single moment when someone weaker than him needs protection and no one else is standing there. The morning the girl fell in front of Caleb Mercer's horse began like any other quiet desert morning, the kind where the sun lifts slowly over the red stone hills and the wind carries the dry scent of dust and sagebrush across miles of open land. Caleb had been riding east along a narrow trail that cut through the edge of Dead Horse Canyon, a place most travelers avoided because the cliffs rose like walls on both sides and the echoes could make a lone rider feel like the land itself was watching him. His horse, a steady gray gelding named Bristle, moved at an easy pace, hooves tapping softly against the hard ground, while Caleb kept one hand resting loosely on the saddle horn. He was a tall man with the quiet posture of someone who had spent years learning how to stay calm when the world around him did not. The wide brim of his hat shaded his eyes as he scanned the horizon the way men out here learned to do without thinking. In the West, distance could mean safety, or it could mean trouble coming fast. For nearly 5 miles that morning the land had been silent except for wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the canyon rim. Then something moved ahead on the trail. At first Caleb thought it was just heat shimmer dancing across the ground, but then the shape staggered again, closer this time. A small figure running through the dust, as if the desert itself were pushing her forward. She stumbled once, caught herself, then kept going until her strength gave out, and she dropped to her knees only a few yards in front of Bristle. Caleb pulled the reins gently, and the horse stopped with a soft snort. The girl looked up slowly, breathing hard, dark hair tangled by wind and travel, her clothing marked by long miles of dust and sun. She couldn't have been more than 20. Around her neck hung a thin leather cord, and tied against her chest was a small bundle wrapped carefully in worn cloth. Her eyes met Caleb's for only a second, but in that second he saw something that told him this was no ordinary traveler who had lost her way. It was the look of someone who had been running for a long time and knew the road behind her was not empty. Caleb swung one boot over the saddle and stepped down into the dirt. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to. Instead, he glanced past the girl toward the trail stretching west through the canyon. At first there was only wind. Then came the faint rhythm of horses somewhere far behind them, steady and growing. The sound carried along the rock walls like a warning whispered through stone. The girl pushed herself halfway up and spoke with a voice rough from thirst. "They are coming," she said quietly. Caleb studied the horizon for a moment longer, then looked back at her with the calm expression of a man who had already made up his mind about something important. "Out here," he said softly, "the road belongs to whoever is still standing on it." Caleb Mercer listened to the distant hoofbeats for another moment, letting the sound roll along the canyon walls like thunder that had not yet decided whether it would break into a storm. The girl was still catching her breath, one hand pressed against the dusty ground as she tried to stand. Caleb reached for the reins of his gray horse and tied them loosely to a low branch of desert scrub, his movements slow and careful, the kind that kept frightened people from feeling cornered. The wind moved through the canyon in long dry breaths, carrying the smell of warm stone and sage. Up above, the cliffs rose nearly 200 feet, their red surfaces catching the morning sun until the rock looked like it was quietly burning. The girl looked at Caleb again, uncertainty in her eyes, as if she was trying to understand why a stranger had not already turned his horse around and ridden away from trouble. Out here that was usually the safest choice. Caleb studied her for a moment. She was small compared to him, but there was a steadiness in the way she held herself that suggested she had been traveling for many miles without giving up. Dust marked the hem of her clothing and the leather bundle tied against her chest had been wrapped with the careful attention people reserved for something important. "What is your name?" Caleb asked calmly. The girl hesitated only a moment before answering. "Tala," she said, her voice still rough but steady. The word carried the rhythm of the Apache language, soft but strong. Caleb nodded once, accepting the name without surprise. The West had room for many kinds of people, even if most towns pretended otherwise. He glanced once more toward the narrow trail cutting through the canyon behind them. The sound of riders had grown clearer now, the steady rhythm of several horses moving at a determined pace. Not fast enough to be reckless, but too steady to belong to travelers simply passing through. Caleb had heard that kind of riding before, during years he rarely spoke about. How many? He asked quietly. Tala turned and looked back down the trail, as if she could still see them through the bends of rock and shadow. 6, she said. Maybe 7. They have followed me since yesterday morning. Caleb rested one hand on the saddle horn and let out a slow breath. 6 riders in a canyon like this meant they believed they had the advantage. Most men did when they traveled in numbers. But numbers did not always decide what happened in places where the land itself had opinions. The wind shifted again, pushing dust in thin spirals across the ground. Tala watched Caleb carefully, perhaps expecting him to mount his horse and leave while there was still time. Instead, he stepped toward the canyon wall and studied the long shadows stretching across the narrow path ahead. Dead Horse Canyon was not a place travelers chose unless they knew the shortcuts through its twisting rock corridors. Caleb knew them well. He had ridden these trails back when he wore a different badge and carried a different kind of responsibility. Those days were behind him now, or at least he had believed they were. Tala followed his gaze toward the canyon passage that curved between 2 tall stone ridges. Where does that trail go? She asked cautiously. Caleb rested his hand against the rough surface of the canyon wall, feeling the warmth of the sun stored inside the stone. That trail, he said slowly, goes somewhere most riders do not expect. Tala studied him with a mix of worry and curiosity. Behind them, the distant hoofbeats continued to echo closer through the canyon. Caleb turned back toward her with the calm expression of a man who had already chosen which direction the day would take. Then I suggest we start walking, he said quietly, because the men behind you believe this canyon is their road. Today they are going to learn it is not. Tala followed Caleb Mercer deeper into the narrow passage of Dead Horse Canyon, while the gray horse moved quietly behind them, its hooves pressing soft prints into the powdery dust. The canyon walls rose high on both sides, nearly 200 feet of layered red stone that curved inward like the ribs of some ancient creature resting beneath the desert sun. The deeper they walked, the cooler the air became, and the sound of the wind faded until only the faint echo of distant riders followed them like a reminder that time was moving forward whether they hurried or not. Caleb walked with steady confidence, his long stride never rushed, his eyes studying every bend in the rock corridor ahead. Tala noticed that he did not need to look back often. Men who truly understood the land did not depend on sight alone. They listened to the wind, the echo of stone, and the silence between sounds. After nearly half a mile, the trail curved sharply around a wall of dark granite, where a narrow dry wash cut across the canyon floor. Caleb stopped there and knelt beside the shallow groove in the dirt, brushing his hand across the ground. The dust shifted lightly beneath his fingers. The wash had not seen rain for months, but the path it created could confuse anyone who did not know how the canyon twisted beyond the next ridge. Tala watched him quietly for a moment before speaking. You know this place well, she said. Caleb stood and glanced up at the cliffs where a hawk circled in slow, silent circles far above the canyon rim. I have traveled these trails before, he answered. A long time ago. His voice carried the calm tone of a man who did not feel the need to explain more than that. Tala studied him carefully. Out here in the West, people often carried stories they never spoke about. The wind returned briefly, moving through the canyon like a low whisper that stirred dust across the ground. The echo of hoofbeats reached them again, louder now, bouncing off the stone walls in uneven rhythms that made it difficult to judge distance. They are closer, Tala said quietly. Caleb nodded once as if the news confirmed something he had already expected. He walked a few steps farther down the trail and pointed toward a narrow gap between 2 tall rock pillars where the canyon passage divided into 2 paths. One trail curved left toward a steep ridge filled with loose stone. The other continued straight ahead into a deeper corridor where the shadows gathered like cool water beneath the cliffs. Most riders would choose the open trail, Caleb said, his voice calm and thoughtful. It looks easier. Tala followed his gaze toward the 2 paths. And which one are we taking? She asked. Caleb rested his hand against the rough stone pillar and looked down the darker corridor ahead. The one they will not expect, he answered quietly. Tala hesitated before stepping closer to him. Why are those men following you? He asked after a moment, his tone still calm but direct. Tala looked down at the small bundle tied against her chest. Her fingers tightened around the worn cloth as if she could feel the weight of the object hidden inside. Because they believe what I carry belongs to them, she said softly. Caleb studied her expression for a moment, then nodded slowly as if the answer confirmed something he had already suspected. Out here, many men chased things they believed would bring them power or fortune. Very few of them understood the cost that came with such pursuits. The sound of the riders echoed again through the canyon, this time clearly close enough that even Bristle lifted his head and flicked his ears toward the trail behind them. Caleb looked once more toward the shadowed path leading deeper into the canyon. Then we should keep moving, he said quietly, because men who ride that hard rarely turn around once they think they are close to what they want. The shadowed corridor swallowed the light as Caleb Mercer led the way between the tall canyon walls, the temperature dropping several degrees as the sun disappeared behind the redstone cliffs. The path narrowed until it was barely wide enough for two horses to pass side by side, and the air carried the quiet echo of footsteps and the steady breathing of Bristle walking behind them. Tala glanced over her shoulder once more. The sound of riders had changed now. It was no longer distant. The rhythm of hooves striking stone drifted through the canyon in uneven waves, bouncing from wall to wall until it was impossible to tell exactly how far away the men were. Caleb noticed the shift as well. He slowed slightly and studied the ground ahead where the trail curved through another bend in the rock. The desert had a way of revealing its secrets to those who paid attention. Here the dust lay thick and undisturbed except for their own tracks and the faint line of the dry wash that twisted across the canyon floor like a pale scar. Caleb stopped beside a fallen slab of sandstone nearly 4 feet tall and rested his hand against the warm rock. Tala stepped beside him, her breathing steadier now, but her eyes still searching the canyon behind them. "The riders will see our tracks," she said quietly. Caleb nodded once. "Yes," he said calmly. "That is the idea." Tala frowned slightly as she tried to understand his meaning. Caleb stepped away from the rock and walked a few yards down the narrow trail until the canyon widened into a shallow bowl of sand surrounded by steep ridges. In the center of the bowl stood a cluster of weathered boulders that rose from the ground like the remains of an ancient wall. He motioned toward the formation. "Bring the horse here," he said quietly. Tala guided Bristle forward and tied the reins to a jagged stone while Caleb studied the ridges above them. The cliffs rose sharply on both sides, nearly 250 feet of layered rock that cast long shadows across the bowl. Small ledges and narrow paths ran along the upper slopes, invisible from below unless someone knew where to look. Tala followed his gaze upward. "You have been here before," she said softly. Caleb gave a small nod. "Many years ago, back when men still asked me to guide them through places like this." Tala studied the canyon again, seeing it differently now. The bowl was not just open ground. It was a natural crossroads where sound echoed in strange ways, and the narrow entrance behind them forced riders to slow their horses as they approached. Caleb walked back toward the center of the sand and knelt briefly, brushing away a thin layer of dust until he uncovered a small cluster of stones placed in a deliberate line. He adjusted 2 of them slightly before standing again. Tala watched the careful movement with curiosity. "What is this place?" she asked. Caleb rested his hand against the worn grip of his saddle as he considered the canyon walls one more time. "This is where the trail changes its mind," he said quietly. Tala tilted her head, unsure whether he was speaking seriously or simply using the strange humor of desert men. The hoofbeats behind them echoed again, louder now, clear enough that even the hawks circling above the canyon rim drifted away from the growing noise. Bristle lifted his head and stamped one hoof against the sand. Caleb looked toward the narrow entrance of the canyon where the riders would soon appear. "The men following you believe they are closing in on something valuable," he said calmly. "That belief will make them hurry." Tala looked at him with a mixture of concern and trust. "And what happens when they arrive?" she asked quietly. Caleb adjusted the brim of his hat and studied the shadowed ridges above the bowl as if measuring the land itself. "Then they will learn something about this canyon that most travelers never discover," he said softly. "In places like this, the land decides who passes through and who must turn back." The canyon bowl held its breath as the sound of approaching riders rolled through the narrow entrance like distant thunder moving between stone walls. Caleb Mercer stood near the center of the sand with the quiet patience of a man who understood that rushing the moment would only make things worse. Tala remained beside Bristle, one hand resting gently against the horse's neck while her eyes stayed fixed on the shadowed passage behind them. The hoofbeats were unmistakable now. 6 horses, maybe 7. Their rhythm uneven as the riders slowed to guide their animals through the tight canyon entrance. Dust drifted into the bowl in thin clouds before the men themselves appeared. The first rider stepped into view with the cautious posture of someone who knew the desert could hide surprises. He wore a long brown coat faded by sun and travel, and the brim of his hat cast a narrow shadow across a face that looked like it had spent years squinting into harsh light. Behind him, the others followed, spreading slowly across the entrance of the bowl, while their horses snorted softly in the cooler air. For a moment, none of them spoke. Their eyes moved between Caleb, the horse tied beside the stones, and the young woman standing near the boulders. The leader's gaze settled on Tala, and a thin smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Well now," he said in a slow voice that carried easily through the quiet canyon air. "Looks like our long ride is finally over." Tala did not answer. She stood still, the cloth bundle pressed carefully against her chest, as if the small object inside carried the weight of something far larger than its size suggested. The riders moved a little farther into the bowl, spreading out in a loose line, while the canyon walls threw their voices back in strange echoes. One of the men studied Caleb with mild curiosity. "You must be the fellow who decided to make this our business," he said. Caleb rested both hands lightly on the saddle horn of bristle and met their attention without hurry. The desert wind stirred briefly across the sand between them, lifting thin spirals of dust that drifted toward the canyon walls. "I suppose that depends on what business you think you have here," Caleb replied calmly. The leader chuckled under his breath. "The kind that belongs to us," he said, nodding toward Tala. "She has something that was promised to our group a long time ago." Caleb glanced toward Tala for a moment, then back to the riders. "Out here promises can be misunderstood," he said quietly. The men exchanged glances, some amused, others impatient. The leader leaned forward slightly in his saddle, studying Caleb with a careful look that suggested he was trying to measure the quiet stranger standing in the sand. "You are standing alone in the middle of a canyon with 6 men who have been riding since sunrise," he said slowly. "That seems like a strange place to argue about misunderstandings." Caleb tipped his hat back just enough to look up toward the cliffs surrounding the bowl. Sunlight touched the upper ridges now, painting the red stone in warm gold while long shadows stretched across the sand below. "I have learned something about places like this," Caleb said thoughtfully. The leader raised an eyebrow. "And what would that be?" Caleb's gaze returned to the riders. "That the land usually knows more about the situation than the men who ride into it," he answered. The canyon fell quiet again. A hawk circled high above the rim, its shadow sliding slowly across the stone walls while the wind whispered softly through the narrow entrance behind the riders. Tala watched Caleb carefully now, beginning to understand that he had not chosen this place by accident. The leader followed Caleb's glance toward the ridges and frowned slightly, as if sensing that something about the canyon bowl was not as simple as it appeared. For the first time since they arrived, the riders shifted uneasily in their saddles, the echo of their horses' breathing drifting across the sand, while the stillness of the canyon seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. The canyon bowl remained still for a long moment after Caleb Mercer spoke, the quiet stretching across the sand like a held breath. The riders shifted slightly in their saddles, exchanging glances that carried more uncertainty now than confidence. The leader studied Caleb with narrowed eyes, his gaze moving slowly from the lone cowboy to the surrounding cliffs as if he was trying to decide whether the calm stranger truly believed his own words or was simply buying time. The wind slipped softly through the narrow entrance of the canyon, brushing across the sand and stirring small ribbons of dust that drifted between the men and vanished against the red stone walls. Finally, the leader leaned back slightly in his saddle and let out a slow laugh that echoed sharply off the canyon walls. "You talk like a man who believes the rocks are listening," he said. Caleb did not smile. "Sometimes they are," he replied quietly. One of the riders to the left turned his horse a few steps forward, studying the ridges above them. The bowl was surrounded by steep cliffs that rose nearly 250 feet into the bright desert sky. From the ground, the rock faces looked smooth and empty, but a careful eye could see narrow ledges winding along the slopes and small paths carved by years of wind and water. The rider squinted upward. This place feels wrong, he muttered under his breath. The leader waved off the concern with a dismissive gesture. It is a canyon, he said. Canyons feel wrong to men who imagine shadows where there are none. His attention returned to Tala. Now then, he continued calmly, let us stop pretending this conversation will last all day. He nodded toward the cloth bundle tied against her chest. Hand over what you are carrying, and we will ride out of here without wasting any more of the morning. Tala held the bundle tightly, her expression steady despite the pressure of 6 riders watching her. Caleb remained where he stood beside the horse, the brim of his hat shading his eyes as he studied the men carefully. You rode a long way for something small enough to fit in one hand, Caleb said quietly. The leader shrugged. Small things sometimes open large doors, he replied. Tala glanced at Caleb for a moment. The calm in his posture had not changed, but something about the way he stood now made the air in the canyon feel different. Caleb slowly stepped away from Bristle and walked a few yards toward the center of the bowl, his boots leaving quiet prints in the soft sand. The riders watched him carefully. That object belongs to her people, Caleb said in the same steady voice. The leader smiled thinly. Everything belongs to someone until someone else decides differently, he said. Caleb looked up toward the canyon rim again where the hawk had returned, gliding slowly across the bright sky. The bird circled once, then disappeared beyond the ridge. The leader followed Caleb's glance and frowned slightly. You keep looking at those cliffs like you expect them to move, he said. Caleb lowered his gaze and met the man's eyes again. Not move, he said calmly. Listen. The words seemed to settle strangely in the quiet bowl. One of the riders shifted again in his saddle and glanced toward the narrow entrance behind them. For a moment the canyon felt heavier somehow, the silence deeper than before. Tala felt it too now. The stillness of the place had changed. The wind had stopped completely, and even the echo of the horse's breathing seemed quieter than it had been moments ago. Caleb spoke again, his voice almost gentle. You have been watching the ground and the girl, he said to the leader. But the ground is not where the real story of this place begins. The leader slowly turned his head and followed Caleb's gaze upward once more. High above them, along the narrow ledges carved into the canyon walls, shapes had begun to appear in the sunlight where moments ago there had only been empty stone. For a moment, none of the riders moved. The canyon seemed to tighten around them, as every eye slowly followed Caleb Mercer's gaze toward the high ridges above the bowl. At first the shapes were easy to mistake for shadows cast by uneven rock, small dark outlines resting along the narrow ledges that twisted across the canyon walls nearly 200 feet above the sand. But shadows do not shift with the quiet patience of living men. One by one the figures became clearer as the sun moved across the stone. Riders on the ground began to realize what they were seeing. Men stood along the ridges, silent and still, their outlines steady against the sky. They did not shout or move forward. They simply watched. The leader's thin smile faded slowly as he studied the canyon walls. How long have they been there? He asked quietly. Caleb did not hurry his answer. Long enough to hear everything that was said here today, he replied. A rider near the entrance of the bowl turned his horse slightly, his eyes moving from one ridge to another as more figures revealed themselves along the narrow stone paths. There were not many, perhaps 8 or 9 in total, but their position high above the canyon floor changed the feeling of the place completely. The riders in the sand were no longer the only men in the conversation. The leader exhaled slowly and looked toward Tala again. You let us into this, he said to her. Tala shook her head gently. I only ran, she replied. Caleb chose the place. The leader studied Caleb again with a thoughtful expression, as if the quiet cowboy standing beside the horse had suddenly become far more interesting than he first appeared. You must have known they would come, the leader said. Caleb gave a small nod. I sent word yesterday afternoon, he said calmly. The wind carried it faster than your horses. One of the riders frowned. You expect us to believe men appeared on those cliffs in a single night, just because you asked them to, he said. Caleb rested his hand lightly on Bristle's saddle. Out here some men travel. Quickly when the message matters, he answered. The leader looked upward again at the silent figures standing along the ridges. Their posture carried the calm discipline of people who had spent generations learning how to move across desert stone without being seen. One of them stepped forward slightly on the ledge, sunlight touching the feathers braided into his dark hair. Even from the canyon floor, it was clear these men were not strangers to the land around them. Tala slowly loosened the cloth bundle from around her neck and held it carefully in both hands. The leader watched the movement with renewed interest. "So that is what all this is about," he said quietly. Tala nodded once and unfolded the worn cloth just enough for the object inside to catch the morning light. A small silver disc rested in her palm, marked with delicate lines that formed the shape of an eagle spreading its wings across the sky. The leader leaned forward slightly in his saddle as recognition touched his expression. "That mark belongs to the Red Mesa people," he said slowly. Tala lifted her chin. "It belongs to my father," she replied. The riders glanced at one another as the meaning of those words settled into the quiet bowl. Caleb watched them carefully, the calm patience still present in his posture. The leader finally looked back toward him with a thoughtful expression. "You did not bring us here to trap us," he said after a moment. Caleb shook his head once. "No," he answered softly. "I brought you here so the truth could arrive before anyone made a mistake they could not take back." The silver disc caught the morning sunlight and reflected it across the quiet bowl of sand like a small piece of the sky itself had fallen into Tala's hands. The riders stared at it with new attention, their earlier confidence replaced by the careful silence of men who suddenly realized the story in front of them was larger than the one they had been chasing across the desert. High above them, the figures along the canyon ridges remained perfectly still, their presence silent but undeniable. The leader slowly removed his hat and wiped a line of dust from the brim while he studied the symbol in Tala's palm. The eagle with open wings was known across the region. Even men who did not belong to the Red Mesa people had heard of it. It marked the house of the chief whose voice carried weight across the valleys and mesas for nearly 100 miles. "You said that belonged to your father," the leader said slowly. Tala nodded once. "My father is Chief Nantan of the Red Mesa people," she replied calmly. The leader glanced toward the silent men on the cliffs again, then back toward the silver disc. "That explains the riders above us," he said quietly. Caleb Mercer stood beside Bristle with the same calm expression he had carried since the moment the riders entered the bowl. "The truth often arrives more quietly than people expect," Caleb said. The leader looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "You sent word to the chief himself, did you not?" he said. Caleb nodded slightly. "I sent word that his daughter was traveling alone and that men were following her who did not yet understand what they were chasing." The leader rested his hands on the saddle horn and exhaled slowly. Around him the other riders shifted uneasily, their earlier confidence fading as the meaning of the moment settled across the canyon. One of the men near the entrance glanced upward again toward the ledges where the Apache watchers stood like dark silhouettes against the bright sky. "They have been here the entire time," he said under his breath. "Waiting." Tala carefully wrapped the cloth around the silver disc again and tied it gently back against her chest. The object was small, yet the meaning it carried had changed the balance of the canyon without a single harsh word being spoken. The leader studied her once more. "We believe that medallion pointed to something valuable," he admitted. "Many stories travel through the frontier. Some men said it marked the location of hidden land rich with silver. Others believed it was the key to a forgotten trail through the mountains." Tala looked at him steadily. "It marks something far more important than silver," she replied. "It marks the promise that the Red Mesa people will always know where their home is." The leader remained quiet for a moment, then gave a small nod as if accepting a lesson the desert had delivered in its own patient way. Caleb looked up toward the ridges once more. The hawk returned again, circling slowly above the canyon rim as the sunlight climbed higher in the sky. After a moment, one of the men on the cliffs stepped forward along the narrow ledge. He raised one hand toward Tala in a silent gesture of recognition before lowering it again. The message was simple and clear even across the distance. The riders in the sand were not surrounded by enemies. They were being watched by protectors who had come to make certain the truth arrived safely. The leader looked back toward Caleb. "You could have chosen a faster way to end this chase," he said quietly. Caleb rested his hand against Bristle's neck and shook his head once. "Fast endings leave too many questions behind," he replied. "Out here it is better when men understand why the road changes beneath their feet." The canyon bowl slowly exhaled as the tension that had filled the air began to loosen like dust carried away by the wind. For several long moments no one spoke. The riders sat quietly on their horses while the men on the high ridges remained steady against the bright sky above. The desert sun had climbed higher now, warming the red stone walls until the canyon glowed with the deep color of old clay. Tala stood calmly beside the cluster of weathered boulders, the small silver disc once again tied safely against her chest beneath the worn cloth. Caleb Mercer remained beside Bristle, one hand resting gently on the horse's neck as if nothing about the moment had surprised him. The leader of the riders finally looked down at the sand between them and nodded slowly to himself. "We followed a story that was never ours to chase," he said quietly. One of his men shifted in the saddle and glanced once more toward the silent watchers on the cliffs. The figures above them had not moved except to adjust their footing along the narrow ledges. They stood with the calm patience of people who understood that sometimes the strongest message came from simply being present. The leader lifted his head again and looked toward Tala. "You ran a long way to bring that medallion home," he said. Tala gave a small nod. "My father asked me to carry it to the Council Valley before the next full moon," she replied. "The people of Red Mesa gather there once each year, so the tribes remember where their roots begin." The leader studied her for a moment, then gave a thoughtful nod of his own. "Some men would have kept riding if they had known that," he said. "Others might have tried to take it anyway." Tala looked toward Caleb for a moment before answering. "Some men choose a different road," she said softly. The leader followed her glance toward the quiet cowboy. Caleb Mercer stood exactly as he had since the riders arrived, calm and steady, like a stone that had always belonged to the canyon floor. The leader removed his hat once more, brushing the dust from the brim before placing it back on his head. Then he turned his horse slowly toward the narrow entrance of the bowl. "It seems the desert has already decided how this morning ends," he said. One by one the other riders turned their horses as well. None of them spoke loudly or made sudden movements. The quiet understanding of the moment had settled across the group like the shadow of a passing cloud. As the first rider reached the canyon passage, he glanced back once more toward Caleb. "Not many men would stand where you stood today," he said. Caleb tipped the brim of his hat slightly. "Most men would not choose to chase a story they do not understand," he replied calmly. The rider gave a small laugh and continued down the trail. Soon the sound of hoofbeats faded back into the winding corridors of the canyon until only the wind remained. High above, the watchers along the cliffs began to move as well. One by one they stepped away from the ledges and disappeared along the hidden paths carved into the red stone walls. Within minutes the canyon returned to the quiet stillness it had carried that morning before the chase arrived. Tala stepped forward into the sunlight and looked toward Caleb with quiet gratitude in her eyes. "My father will want to thank you," she said gently. Caleb rested both hands on the saddle horn and looked toward the distant canyon rim where the hawk still circled in the bright sky. "Tell him the road was already there," he said. "I only stood in the right place when someone needed it." Tala smiled faintly and began preparing Bristle for the ride east toward Red Mesa. The desert wind moved softly through the canyon once more, carrying the scent of sagebrush. Across the sand, out here the land remembered everything that passed through it. And sometimes the greatest stories were not the ones about men who fought for power, but the quiet moments when someone simply chose to stand between danger and a stranger who needed a path home.